Welcome back to The Shed. Today I want to take a look at the 1996 Nebula award-winning novel, Slow River by Nicola Griffith. So I've got a fair bit to say about this novel, so what I would like to do is provide a bit of a brief plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like, I'll put it to the memory test, I'll make some recommendations and we'll rank it on our growing sci-fi shed ladder, where I think I pretty much have determined where this one will sit tonight. So the novel really tells the story of Lore Van Oosterling, and it's done in a very interesting way because the novel is in 3 different narrative streams, and in chronological order it sort of talks to Lore's upbringing in this very powerful and wealthy family who have made their billions by patenting scientific and technological aspects dealing with water sewage treatment. So a rather interesting way, and it's a rather pleasing and interesting setting as well that Nicola Griffith has done here, one that you don't often see in science fiction. The second narrative stream, and these narrative streams flick between first and third person as well in 3 different timelines, which I found rather interesting. But it also talks to her escaping from what appears to be an abduction or kidnapping attempt, and her being rescued by this person called Spanner. And these are not huge spoilers. You pretty much find this out in the first chapter or 2, so there's not huge spoilers in what I'm providing here as a plot overview, but she's sort of taken in by this person called Spanner, and again she's trying to deal with what happened to her childhood, what happened during this kidnapping attempt, and her dealing with that in whatever way she possibly can, and the rather interesting relationship that she has with Spanner in the works. To ultimately the third part of this story, which is her in the present tense, her working in this sewage treatment plant and trying to make her independence, and ultimately dealing with her past and the way of dealing with her past as well, in a rather interesting novel that really talks about trauma and how to overcome trauma, the problems you have with the barriers that you put up and dealing with that. And in many ways it's a story of growth and also ethics, class and identity as well. So rather interesting story. So what was it that I enjoyed in this one? Look, I did enjoy the writing. I think the highlight for me in this novel was Nicola's writing. I thought she had a really wonderful, descriptive and evocative way of writing that I thoroughly enjoyed. By far the standout for me was her writing. I also did enjoy the characters. I've always enjoyed books that have got flawed characters, and this one has several. Actually, I think just about every single character in this novel has got some human flaw that is very evident. So I did enjoy her characters, and again her writing sort of made you interested in these characters, that you wanted to understand what's going on here, what's the past, and the flaws in her dealing with her trauma. So I did enjoy that aspect of it as well. So definitely the writing and the characters were the highlight for me in this one. There was also a section in this novel that talked to this sewage treatment plant, and she goes into quite a fair bit of science describing the nitrogen cycle and how one goes about treating wastewater, which I found was interesting as well. And I did enjoy that aspect of the novel. But that sort of talks straight to my dislikes. And this is a big one for me, right? Now, when I read science fiction, there needs to be science fiction in the novel, and not necessarily just science. And I think that's the biggest criticism I have of this novel. There is science, but there's very little science fiction. I mean, the only thing that makes this science fiction, apart from 1 or 2 little things like, her predicting that we'd be walking around with slabs or tablets, right? But there's just very little science fiction. And the only science fiction really is that, any kind of identification is done through this PETA. I can't remember what PETA was, but basically it's a chip that's implanted between your forefinger and thumb that sort of dictates, it will describe your identity, right? And that really was the only science fiction in this novel. And it didn't really play a huge part in the plot at all, apart from the fact that she was trying to run away from the past, and she used this PETA chip as a means to getting a new identity, right? So I'd have to say that the biggest flaw in this is that there's just no science fiction to talk at all in this novel. And when we talk about, the weighted inputs I use to rank these novels on the board, I think it will reflect quite severely on where this novel will actually rank. So yeah, my biggest takeaway is there's just not enough science fiction at all. I would have to say that this is not a piece of science fiction, but this is just literary fiction, right? There's just no science fiction in here at all that I think that would appeal to a science fiction fan. It definitely did not appeal to this science fiction fan. I've also criticised novels in the past, particularly vintage science fiction novels, the likes of Heinlein and Asimov. I'm on record as stating that, sometimes Heinlein in particular and Isaac Asimov, their portrayal of women was just terrible, right? Sometimes there was just no women characters at all in the novel. And when there were women characters, they were often just not what you would call a strong female character. And I'd have to say, I'd have to have the same exact criticism of this novel, but with the roles reversed. There is just no strong male character in this novel at all. And all the male characters were just very, very weak characters and just painted in a very terrible light. Now, I can't talk to exactly why that is without giving spoilers away, but I'd have to say that the male characters in this novel, it's just the exact same criticism I have of Heinlein and Asimov. It needs to be a balance. For my personal reading pleasure, you need to have a balance of good, strong female leads, because my experience has been, and I'd say that 90% of viewers' experience out there is, that there are strong women characters, and as there are strong male characters in our world that we so happily live in at times. And it needs to be portrayed in novels like this, and you can't tilt one way or the other. So again, I'd have to say that's a pretty big criticism for me. And I've made that same criticism when the roles are reversed and we find really weak female characters. It just needs to be a balance. And what I don't understand is that, this book was written in the 1990s, and I could understand and almost appreciate if that was done in the 50s and /60s. But we have the likes of Ursula Le Guin, who's written wonderful science fiction over the years with strong male and female characters. So I just didn't really understand why it had to go this way. So look, big criticism for me. I just didn't enjoy that aspect of the novel. The other criticism I would make, which sort of explains the small intro and plot overview in this one, is that there's not really much happening with the plot. Like, it doesn't take you long to sort of understand what this novel is talking about. But I'd have to say, I was 125 pages in. I remember clearly looking at the page count, thinking I'm 125 pages into this novel, and I really still don't know what I'm going to talk to when it comes to my plot overview. I sort of formulate and tabulate my plot overview as I'm reading this, right? And I really couldn't understand what I was going to talk to. I remember talking to my partner, talking to my children, saying, I just literally have nothing to say about the plot overview. It is slow, and I think the title, it sort of summarizes it. It is slow river, and I think that you've just got to enjoy the writing in this one, because for me there was very little else I thoroughly enjoyed in this one. So what about the memory test? I read this novel in '96 when it was nominated for the Nebula, just after I'd read The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson that won the Hugo that year. And I thought it was going to be pretty much guaranteed that Neil Stephenson would win the award that year, the Nebula Award. And when I realised the Slow River one, I was sort of surprised, because I read the synopsis online as the book was nominated, and I thought, yeah, this is probably not one that I would enjoy. I doubted it would win a Nebula, and I was very surprised when it did. And I would have to say, when it comes to the memory test, as I was reading through this, there was literally nothing I could remember about it. And when I finished the novel and I put it down, I was sort of really surprised, and I was asking myself, how did this novel win a Nebula Award? And I sort of wanted to refresh my memory and say, well, what was it up against? And I realized it was up against one of the big names in science fiction, in Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age. And that was definitely what came to memory, is I remember almost to the day when I realized that this novel won over Neil Stephenson's. That was my initial response as well. How could this novel have beaten Neil Stephenson? And that was my key memory recall on this one. So not a positive one, because it only reflected my surprise and astonishment as to how this one could possibly have won a Nebula Award when we're talking about science fiction, right? Not just literary fiction. So what about recommendations then? Can I still recommend this one? If you like Dean Koontz novels, I would say this is at times reminded me of Dean Koontz. And I've read a fair bit of Koontz over the years. So this sort of reminded me. So I would have to say, if you're a Dean Koontz fan, this may appeal to you because Dean also has elements of science fiction in some of his novels with that thriller suspense sort of flavor to these novels. And I would have to say that this is what this particular novel reads like. So could I recommend this then to science fiction or fantasy fans? Look, if you enjoy the novels on the Sci-Fi Share Ladder, and you largely agree with where I place these novels, and you largely agree with my selection criteria as to why that is, then I'd have to say I don't think you'll enjoy this novel, and I cannot recommend it to you as a science fiction or a fantasy novel. It's just not science fiction. I just stress, you just cannot, in my humble opinion, call a book science fiction because that you throw a bit of science in there and you put a chip in someone's hand and say that that's a form of identity, hence it must be a near future environment. That just does not rank for me. Which is going to be rather interesting to see where this one lands on our science fiction shed ladder, because one of the weighted inputs I look at is that science fiction or fantasy theme. How strong is it, and how well has it been executed? So let's flip the cameras around and see exactly where this one lands. So back to the share ladder and ranking tonight's 1996 Nebula award-winning novel, Slow River by Nicola Griffith. Now my criteria that I use, my weighted input criteria that I use when ranking these novels, which I've documented in the description, the concept and execution is very highly weighted, right? And I mentioned in my overview that as a science fiction concept, this rated a 0. There is, in my view, just not enough science fiction in this at all to warrant its place on the Sci-Fi Share Ladder when we're talking about science fiction and fantasy novels. There was just not enough in it for me to say that this is a science fiction novel. So it got a 0, which is going to drastically dictate where it sits on the shed ladder. Now, the other things that I look at, which also weighted, is the writing and the characters. And I would have to say that the writing and the characters in Slow River, I didn't mind. I thought it was in the average, somewhere in the middle of the bunch. It was very good writing at times, which I enjoyed. There was some question marks around the first and third person point of view, and also the 3 different narrative streams, but I personally didn't mind that. But I know it would influence some people's, reading pleasure. So I haven't assessed it that way for myself, but I guess just be warned that can throw some people off. But it wasn't necessarily my experience, so it's still rated pretty well when it comes to the characters and the writing. But I think the plot, again, reading a book for 125 pages, and it's I think a 300 odd page book, right? Getting more than a third of the way through the book and still not really understanding why am I reading this, and would I care to put this book down and not get to an ending? See, that's the other thing when I say, the writing and the plot, right? If I'm reading through a book and I get to about a third or 2/3, in some cases, 2/3 of the way through the book, and I think to myself, if I was to put this book down now and never pick it up again, would that be a bad thing, right? Would I regret that decision? And I got to a third of the way through this novel, and I just didn't care. I thought to myself, I don't really care how this novel ends. But there was still enough in there for me to want to finish the novel, to bring all those 3 narratives together. So again, it lost some marks there. It also didn't do well at all when it comes to the memory test. And again, I think it's because of those concepts, right? What really stands strong in my head, as we've seen in some of the novels that hit the A side, is that memory test, right? And just to illustrate again, the science fiction themes, right? Hyperion ranking number one at the moment, and that's because it's got so many strong science fiction concepts all in that one 500-page novel, right? So there were just so much concepts. I'm just trying to illustrate how my mind works when it comes to ranking these novels and what I look for in a science fiction or fantasy novel. And that's why we do have things like Hyperion. And to some degrees, you know, one of my all-time favorite novels, Flowers for Algernon, is sitting towards the bottom of the middle bunch. Again, I thought that was an absolutely beautifully written novel, wonderful characters, good plot, fantastic ending, but there's just not a whole lot of science fiction in there, right? Because what made it science fiction is this surgery that doesn't exist. But apart from that, that's all you got, right? Which affected it severely on the sci-fi shed ladder. So when I look at my criteria, I really can't say anything other than it's going to be on the bottom of the bunch. And I'm going to get straight to it, and I'm still not even convinced, but it's going to be between, below the 5th season or above the 5th season. And I've made up my mind, and I'm going to plug it just above the 5th season, because I thought the writing was better than what we saw in the 5th season. I'd have to say that Jameson's writing just doesn't, at least in that novel, just didn't appeal to me. But I'd have to say I did not finish the 5th season first time round, because it's a much larger book, and I got halfway through the middle of it, and you can see my full review down below. But it just did not hold my attention, and I just didn't really care to understand what was going to happen to those characters. And to some degrees, I felt the same similarly with Slow River, but I think the characters were just a little bit better. So look, it's a difficult one. Honestly, Slow River, I was debating whether or not it would be at the bottom of the shed ladder. And the only reason it's not sitting on the bottom is because the writing is a little bit better, and I did manage to read the whole novel without putting it away and forgetting completely all about it. Look, perhaps a controversial one, because it's a rather interesting novel, and I think if this was a board, if I wasn't into science fiction and I wasn't the sci-fi shed guy, and I was the thriller suspense guy, I would have to say that this novel would probably be ranking quite well. It's a decent novel, but I can't justify its place anywhere other than where it is on the sci-fi shed ladder. Hey, thank you for joining me in the shed. I would really love to hear your opinions on this one, because I know I threw some controversial curveballs in there. So I'd love to see what your thoughts are, but I'm trying to be honest and transparent as much as I can, and that's where we are tonight. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you next time in the shed.